right, I am super excited because Singapore is one of my favorite countries, and here we are in Los Angeles talking, and it's great to have you here, Sean.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Mark.
So the first thing I want to address, because you told me a little bit about it before, but this is what I love about home, doing interviews at home, is you see what's going on with the people. It's a little more authentic. Can you just share with us? We got that beautiful piece behind you.
Sure. So my wife went to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and she bought this after the trek. I believe it's from Tanzania, but I may be mistaken on the country.
Now, are those candles?
No, I think they're actually meant to be traditional. It's an actual sort of traditional tribal group from that area. So you see the kind of long individuals.
Oh, super, super cool. And you told me that she's promised or warned that you're coming with her the next time.
Promise, I'd be very happy to go. I do enjoy the outdoors.
Awesome, awesome. Well, it's super to have you here on our Leaders Who Care series, and from what I see with your background, you certainly qualify for a leader who cares, and we'll get into that. But can you initially just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, and we'll chat?
Thanks, Mark. So I'm currently a managing partner at a firm called Global Impact Partners. We're currently based across Singapore, Australia, India, although we are looking to set up a US office shortly. And our whole focus as a firm in impact investment is working with families, institutional investors, foundations, and development finance institutions to unlock the flow of capital to serve people on the planet. Now, this takes a number of forms. So we work across sectors including infrastructure and real assets, healthcare, and that's been particularly relevant in the current COVID situation, renewable energy and sustainable technology, and finally, sustainable agriculture. And the reason we focus on these sectors is because we've seen opportunities to really deliver scalable solutions for impact across these. On the other side, what we see in terms of asset owners, whether it's large pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, or even family offices, is the real interest and demand in then finding ways that we can actually use capital in a meaningful way to deliver this transformative impact on the ground. We've had a big focus on the Asia Pacific region, although increasingly our health work is quite global. And I guess sort of leading into this, my background was I worked as a corporate lawyer at a firm called Herbert Smith Freehills for a number of years, in both structured finance and M&A. And prior to that, I'd done a stint serving as an army officer, in the infantry, and then afterwards, a short stint as part of the Singapore Youth Delegation to the UN Commission on Sustainable Development. But that sort of trajectory, and definitely I think the military gave me grounding in that, along with, I'd say, another transformative experience, being a resolution fellow, where I was very lucky to, I think, have leaders who at a young stage in life sort of help guide me and show me the potential of what taking a lead initially on a university-run project could then have in turning that into a career path.
Yeah, it's amazing how you can get influenced positively by those type of things and those type of people. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too, for sure. A lot of people, thanks to Simon Sinek especially, talk about their why. But I like to ask it a little bit different way is, why do you do what you do?
Sure. So at the core of it, for me, it actually stems from my faith. So I'm a practicing Hindu. And what we believe in Hinduism, at least the denomination within which I follow, is that we have a fundamental duty, or what we call our dharma, to use our skills, resources, capacity that we've been given to contribute back to society. And the analogy we use in Hinduism is this idea of what's called a yajna, or a fire, right? A communal fire. And everyone contributes towards that in a way that ultimately we all benefit more from that than what we put in. And so to me, given the opportunities, experience, networks I've had, to me, this was the path where I felt I could give the most. Initially, at one point, I was considering a military career, and I felt even in the work we did overseas in deployments, that was valuable, but ultimately the platform that allowed me to deliver the greatest impact was through impact investment. And it was a path that guided me, I guess, into corporate law, where initially I thought helping structure these deals and opportunities could be a valuable path, but I felt being at the leading edge of that would extend that impact even further.
It's one thing I love about the Hindu religion. First of all, I find it like so right on so many things for in the first place, but that whole aspect of it's your duty, as you put it, to make a contribution to community, to make an impact. I don't know exactly how you phrase it, but to me, that's like so critical. And it aligns with and segues into what I wanted to ask you next about. It's kind of taken decades for leaders to realize almost that it's their duty to do something good, in the world. But it's also, and maybe this was the tipping point, it's also they realize good for business, and it's actually good and almost required to be able to get talent, the really good talent, to join them, basically. So you've been involved in a lot of these global challenges: sustainable development, impact investing, equal access to healthcare, and things like that. I'm kind of partially answering the question, but I'll say it anyways. What do you think differentiates you as a leader who cares?
If I had to put my finger on it, I think I would like to say it's authenticity. And what I mean by authenticity is, the jump into impact investment. It came about through, I guess, initially a number of conversations, talking to people, etc. But when I ultimately made the call, the tough decision was I was in a very secure role in a great law firm. And to kind of leave that security, stability, and the respect my peers had for me and what we were doing, that was a tough decision. And especially, I'd say Australia and Asia, in my experience, have typically been less entrepreneurial and less risk taking than a lot of that sort of culture that I see in the United States. And so there was a bit more of, I guess, a headwind against making that decision. But I spent a few days, trying to spend a bit of time with myself, digesting, and from that silence, that stillness and connection within comes clarity, right? Because I think often we're so busy trying to capture data, we're not able to capture that data and transform that into internal wisdom and understanding. And I think that inner connection was valuable in having that. And I think that's then translated through in the work we do, right? With a clear purpose in what we're doing. When we wake up in the morning, we know exactly why we're here and what we're doing it for. I think that's helped me have clarity in decision making, especially when we had to make some quite tough calls. There have been a number of quite lucrative mandates we've turned down because to us it didn't fit what we would hold up as a sustainable standard. Those are important short-term sacrifices for long-term gain, because that builds a team who have the integrity and the values and will follow you through it. And you do end up sort of then, I guess, being able to hone in on the people you want with you on that long-term journey and partners you take on that. So I think that's been a valuable aspect of the journey. If I had to sort of distill it down to one point.
Well, that's a good point. So, I was just thinking about things my grandparents used to say, and they were from at that time the Soviet Union and Ukraine, and they would say, the most, as long as you have your health, it's the most important thing, with the accent like that. And then they say, and then it's education, which is number two, but the health. And it wasn't a slogan. It wasn't like a quick, a cute remark. It was like really authentic, but because everything they've gone through, health is the most important. So with respect to where we are in the world right now, you got technology going, a mile a minute. You've got COVID, just when we thought that was enough, which should have been, have the whole social justice hitting the tipping point that had to come sooner or later. It's just amazing it came with all this. And then you got storms even going all over the place now. So what I'd love to hear from you, because of your experiences, even Army, to making an impact in the world, and what you talked about with respect to time with yourself to determine really what's going on and where the right things to do. How do you see everybody's awareness coming about now, whether they're at work or play or in their community, for the future?
To clarify, Mark, awareness of their role and what they can contribute to society in general?
Yeah, and awareness of, are they in the right place at work, or what are they doing at work? Like you said, taking a particular client or not, and
Sure.
they're acting at home with their family and the time they're spending. What's the difference you see that's going to happen of that type of awareness?
Sure. I mean, I think the one thing any kind of crisis, any challenge certainly unearths is it forces a questioning, right? I mean, we've seen internally at our firm, we've seen with a lot of people we work with, and outside of that, in our personal relationships, the people we interact with. I think the fundamental, I guess, in some ways, dislocation the current situation has put upon us, also the questioning, right, of why I'm doing what I'm doing. Is that the path I'm meant to be on? And should I consider alternatives? And in many ways, I think it shakes you out of the inertia you may be in and allows for that deep questioning, right? Which we might never be doing otherwise, if not for this. Even I know I can speak internally, forced us to have a deep rethink about what we were doing. And if anything, double down our focus on health, which we'd already been doing before, but really brought a laser focus to that work.
Yeah, it's amazing. And we talked about, equal access to healthcare, for example,
Yeah.
and how the underserved communities have been hit the hardest. And we all knew what's going on, but for some reason we didn't act upon it. And do you foresee then that awakening will take on real action, real progress?
I think we have a real opportunity to start reshaping that, right? Because in many ways, what this has laid bare is we are not detached. Health had often been seen as islands before, especially when you had that shift of NCDs versus clinical disease. You could start to nearly pocket out. Now, what this has shown is how interconnected we all really are. And I think that's a fundamental shift we're seeing because you can't avoid the fact on a national level, if you've got a rising COVID-19 case count, that is tied in many ways some of these social inequalities, especially when you then break that down to things like death rates, comorbidities, that drives it up. So, I mean, part of the work we've been doing in health, we're very lucky to work with a team that initially developed technology out of Stanford Medical School, led by Associate Professor Rajesh Shasha, called Health Pals. They've developed an AI platform that's able to analyze entire population data sets to identify who the individuals at risk, what their care gaps are, and then work with healthcare providers to then provide guideline-based care to those individuals. Now, one interesting point we saw from data the UNDP shared with us from the WHO is the fact that someone with no pre-existing comorbidities had a 1.4% mortality rate. On the other hand, someone with cardiovascular disease had a 13.2% mortality rate. Hypertension, I think it's 9.8, diabetes 9.6%, and so on. So what we see is it's not just a binary yes, no COVID-19. It actually then becomes a spectrum of mortality and risk, which then raises the fundamental question, what are the drivers of these? So we had done analysis for the New South Wales Treasury in Australia, and we showed them a map initially of the socioeconomic distribution of wealth across New South Wales, so income levels per suburb. Suburb is probably, I guess, like a county in the United States. And then we overlaid that map in the next slide with diabetes prevalence. And you only saw a one-for-one map of that with Western Sydney, which basically had the lower incomes, but also much higher diabetes rates within that. And so that then inherently is then posing a much higher risk factor for these comorbidities and then driving COVID-19 risk. So to me, I think it's fundamentally important we think about how to address these issues. And I think it then comes to a question of health access, right? How do we have the right structures to provide the adequate resourcing for early prevention, which can often sometimes be lacking? And I think that's what we've tried to really have an impact on, through looking at structural outcomes-based financing instruments. So in these, institutional investors finance the upfront costs of preventative programs. And as that delivers savings to governments, insurers, and health systems, the idea is they contract to share a portion of those savings with investors under this structure. And the idea is this allows for greater social impact while providing an attractive return, risk-adjusted return to these investors. So it allows for impact at scale.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And again, I think everybody knew logically that if we give equal access to healthcare, the impact on everything else is huge. And preventive healthcare is way better than just fixing something later. You're right. We have a client that has AI technology, the only FDA cleared technology to manage diabetes and prevent blindness, for example. And it's got access now into the underserved areas where they have a more propensity for diabetes, because that's where agriculture and food comes in, because they're only got crappy food available to them that they can even afford. So it's talk about circular economy, right? It's the whole ball game. And I think you're right. I think this hopefully is the smack in the face, if you will, about this is actually good time to really make dramatic positive change that'll be better for business and community. And so with that said, how do you see business leaders who care what their role should be now with respect to the well-being of their employees? Let's face it, the employees are the community at the end of the day. So with respect to their financial well-being, but also their physical and mental well-being, what role should they play?
Organizations, Mark, in terms of taking that holistic engagement for employees.
Yeah.
So I think what we've definitely seen, and perhaps this is a function of the role some corporations have had in society. I know in the work we've been doing in India, it's been particularly interesting with some of the larger conglomerates, because in many ways they've seen themselves as stewards of the communities in which they work, right? Because I mean, some organizations have been around 50, 100 years and employ large sections of the community. There's that real sense of stewardship in what they do, because their fortunes in some ways are intrinsically tied to the communities in which they work, right? So I'll give you an example. There's one major Indian conglomerate, we're working with a group chief medical officer, right? He goes, well, look, if I have a fundamentally healthier workforce, it directly ties down to productivity, right? So to the extent we can more effectively manage their health, it is tied into obviously the financial impact because they provide a full coverage in healthcare. But when you look at the median tenure these employees spend with that company, a number of them are lifetime employees from the time they either come out as graduates or out of high school, right? Or even as day laborers, all the way through to when they might be in their 60s. So there is that, I guess you're intrinsically tied to what happens in the lives of those employees. And so that really fosters that sense of responsibility and stewardship, and in many ways aligns those interests. So I think increasingly we see that tie in. What I think COVID has sort of flagged for us is on the other side of this, as investors increasingly start to value and analyze the ESG of these companies, right, we increasingly start to see where the risks, right, can sometimes be laid bare. The other side, it also creates opportunities where you have the chance to generate alpha if we're able to focus in on the right companies that do generate these long-term sustainable returns through better working with the stakeholders that surround them.
Yeah, we talked about ESG. I keep hearing over and over that without the S, it's almost impossible. You need the S in there. Can you hear me? Big time.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, we were just talking today actually about ESG in this conference and how the S is so spectacular, if you will, to play on that, and how you were talking about agribusiness too. The whole thought process of rethinking how we grow, how to make it not just sustainable but regenerative, and so on and so forth. Are you engaged in that realm as well?
So we have done work in sustainable agriculture. Actually, one of the first clients we worked with was a ag tech company with they were basically subsurface, very low flow irrigation system that used 80% less water than drip. We worked with them and the government of Botswana to actually grow crops in the Kalahari Desert with low income farmers. And I still remember planting this stuff before their summer and coming back at the end of summer and seeing carrots, tomato, and canola growing in one of the driest areas on earth, right? So I think, yes, as the land available for agriculture increasingly shrinks, as the population grows, there's a kind of pincer effect, but it's important we do this sustainably, right, for the long term. And obviously, I mean, this is one simple example of irrigation. I think there's a spectrum of solutions need to come together to effectively do that. So we certainly see that. And in Asia, it's a particular focus. We've seen Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund Temasek take a very focused view on agriculture technology, because in many ways for Singapore, it is tied in to our, I guess, long-term, not just sustainable development, but for our existence, right? To be able to feed the country effectively and have secure food supply chains, which COVID-19 has laid bare, right? Initially, as food supplies sort of potentially were threatened, it was valuable to actually have domestic food production capacity.
Yeah, it's funny how Mother Nature works. Way back when, everybody grew their own food in their community and ate it. It wasn't shipped all over the place through supply chains, and now it is. And when that supply chain breaks, it's a big problem, right?
Absolutely.
So it's funny how you do get back to basics sooner or later. And when you grow in your own community, then your community becomes stronger as well in all different ways. There's this expression I love. There's been studies on it where they said the thing that fills people's hearts and souls the most of all is belonging.
Mm.
And that means community. And that relates to equal access to healthcare, growing your own food, et cetera, et cetera. It's all related. One last question. What do you see the most dramatic changes that are coming with your impact in the work you do with impact investing? What do you see as the most dramatic changes that you believe are coming?
Very good question, Mark. If I had to select one key trend, I think in many ways sometimes things have been looked at in silos. So we've got renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, as we spoke about, healthcare, urban development. I think increasingly we're going to be less able to look at these within silos, and it's going to be critical to have cross-cutting solutions. And I'll give you one example of that. One of the original sustainable development projects we got mandated on is a $5 billion smart city in India. So they're building this just outside Mumbai with the firm. It was initially a government agency, but they're the firm which actually built Singapore. So they took Singapore from where we were in the 1960s, which was essentially, like what my grandparents grew up in, farmhouses, low density urban housing, to Singapore we see today. So they built something like over 73% of Singapore's current residential stock. Now this firm called Shan Bannirchelvam works around the world on developing this. Mm-hmm. So we've been working with their team in India on developing this urban development project, which will, I think, eventually come to about 300,000 people. So initially, when they're looking at sustainable aspects, they're looking at things like smart grids, renewable energy, etc. Now what we're exploring is actually how you tie many different aspects into it. So health, we're looking at smart toilets. We can actually detect diabetes and infectious disease early. Mm-hmm. Sensors which go in for that. How do you then tie that in to water management, right, and other conditions? Because these social challenges, while they are significant, are not necessarily intractable if we actually have cross-cutting solutions to it. And I think this is where increasingly we need to take this approach where we cut across our verticals to develop holistic, long-term, sustainable development solutions. And I think that's what to me is the most promising as we break down our silos and work together to deliver this impact.
Yeah, and that's where basically putting the investments into our community.
Exactly.
And that's what Leaders Who Care do, right?
That's what we try to.
We can't try, we have to do it.
Absolutely.
Hey, listen, thank you so much for being who you are and what you're doing and participating.
Thank you, Mark. I'm so glad to have had this opportunity.